Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere dusty, creaky, and just a little suspicious. Picture a lonely mill on the edge of a village, its great wooden wheel turning endlessly with the groan of old timbers and splashing water. The smell of damp grain hangs in the air, and the faint grinding of millstones echoes like a heartbeat. You step inside, ducking under low beams, brushing past sacks of flour so fine it clings to your clothes. There's no electricity, no buzz of machines, just the rhythmic scrape of gears, the shush of flour falling into wooden bins, and the nagging sense that someone's always watching. Because here, even in the 1300s, people really cared about carbs. And here's the thing, you probably wouldn't survive this. I mean it. You'd sneeze in the flour once, miscount a scoop, or look at the wrong person's grain the wrong way and boom. Pitchforks. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how far this sleepy little time machine travels. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the frost-bitten morning, boots crunching old hay and stray oat husks. The sun hasn't yet dared to peek over the hills, but already the mill creaks to life. There's something both eerie and comforting about that slow, endless grind, the kind of sound that could lull you to sleep, or keep you up with a knot in your stomach. Inside, you see him, the miller, dusty cloak, eyes shadowed with half-sleep, face lined from too many nights watching sacks, counting grains and calculating debts in his head. He nods at you without smiling. Too early for that. You nod back, unsure whether to step further in. And that's when you notice it, how he's standing near the millstone, but not on the grinding platform. How his left hand is resting lightly on a wooden club. It's not a threat. Not exactly. Just a habit. Like someone who keeps one eye open during naps. Because here's what no one tells you about medieval millers: they were vital, but barely trusted. They handled everyone's grain, sometimes their only food for the week, and they had 100 quiet ways to shave off a little extra for themselves. Not always maliciously. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was tradition. Sometimes it was boredom. But that meant everyone from hungry peasants to overly nosy nobles suspected them of stealing. And not without reason. Historians still argue whether medieval millers were unusually dishonest or simply easy scapegoats for villagers who didn't understand how flour worked. Was the miller pocketing grain? Or was there less yield because your wheat was full of bugs? Hard to say. But if your family went hungry, someone had to take the blame, and the guy covered in flour and muttering to himself was a convenient target. So yes, this miller slept with one eye open. And not metaphorically, sometimes literally, right on a burlap sack near the entrance. Club nearby, dog curled at his feet, and that one eye tracking shadows at the door. Because sometimes it was just a boy trying to steal oats, and sometimes it was angry men demanding their share back. No matter what the tally said, you watch him load grain into the hopper, his movements practiced, almost gentle. The millstone begins to turn, pulled by the great water wheel outside. The whole building rumbles slightly, as though alive. The grain falls in with a soft rush, and after a beat, fresh flour drizzles into the bin below. It's hypnotic. You want to stay and watch, maybe nap by the fire? But the miller glances at you again, not unkindly but alert. He knows too well what it means to be caught off guard. The flour is pale and warm when you run your fingers through it, like fine sand from a sunlit beach. And just like beach sand, it gets everywhere. The miller doesn't speak much, but gestures to a tall ledger by the door. Every bag that enters is noted. Every scoop of flour that leaves. Not because he's organized well, also because of that, but mostly because someone is bound to accuse him of theft eventually. And a well-kept book is the closest thing to armor he has. You hear footsteps outside and both of you freeze. The miller casually leans back against the shelf, hand still near the club. The door creaks. It's just a neighbor's boy with a delivery. But for a second, your heart did a little jig. That's the thing about mills, they're supposed to be boring, but they hum with tension. It wasn't just theft millers feared, it was sabotage. Other millers, jealous of a good water source or a loyal village contract, could easily sneak in at night and throw a stone into the wheel track, or cut the leather belt. Or worse, flour was money, and money always attracts the kind of trouble that doesn't knock first. Still, this one keeps working. You help a little hauling sacks, brushing dust. It's strangely satisfying. Meditative. But the moment you stop moving, you feel it again, that need to glance over your shoulder, as if you've stepped into someone else's life, and they're used to watching their back while they sleep. Eventually, the day brightens. The line of villagers grows. More grain comes in. The miller's posture relaxes only slightly. And you realize he's been doing this for decades. Maybe his father did too. Maybe the club belonged to him. Passed down like an heirloom no one wants to admit they need. And as the grindstone turns, the flour falls and the ledger fills, the miller smiles. Just once. But even then, his other eye never leaves the door. You lean against the cool stone wall of the mill and let your eyes wander to the wooden beams above, blackened with decades of smoke and flour dust. Outside, the sun creeps higher, and with it, the morning line lengthens. Villagers shuffle forward with their sacks of grain, some chatting softly, others eyeing the place like they're visiting a fortune teller they don't trust. Because even though this mill is essential, it stands at the village's edge for a reason. Not just for convenience to the stream, either. You start to notice it the longer you're here. The glances, the wariness, the way people greet the miller with a nod, not a smile, as if they're dealing with a butcher who may or may not nibble the meat before wrapping it. And maybe they're not wrong. The miller offers each visitor the same treatment, measured, neutral, businesslike. He logs their name, the amount of grain, and gives them a rough estimate for when the flour will be ready. No promises, no pleasantries, and once they step outside, they rarely linger. Millers, you come to understand, occupied a strange role in medieval society. They weren't peasants. Not exactly. They worked with their hands. Sure, but their trade was technical, specialized, and crucial. Without mills, villagers were left pounding grain with mortars and pestles, a process so soul-draining it makes peeling potatoes seem like a vacation. But with all that necessity came suspicion, because millers were often the only ones in town handling everyone's food, and there was no one to double-check their work. You listen as the gears groan beneath the floor. The rhythm is off today just slightly. The miller hears it too. He frowns, adjusts a wooden beam, mutters something about the stone singing wrong. It's a phrase he uses casually, but you realize it's important. Each mill has its own voice, and millers learn it like a lullaby mixed with an alarm bell. A change in pitch could mean trouble. Stones wearing unevenly. Something jamming the wheel. Or worse, someone messing with it. And the paranoia isn't new. Historians still argue whether medieval communities truly distrusted millers because of actual scandals, or if the profession simply attracted loners and eccentrics who didn't blend well with village life. Some even suggest millers preferred this isolation. After all, being out at the edge of town means fewer prying eyes ideal if you're quietly skimming extra flour or smuggling illicit goods in a grain sack. As you step outside for air, you notice the location of the mill itself, perched just past the last thatched roofs. It's close enough to serve the town, but not close enough to be one of them. And that wasn't accidental. Watermills needed flow, but they also needed space and discretion, because no one wanted flour dust clouding up their washing lines. And villagers loved blaming millers when water turned murky or crops failed. There's an odd mix of awe and resentment toward the mill. Kids are warned not to play near it, but they sneak glances anyway, fascinated by the turning wheel, the endless motion. Some believe the building never truly sleeps, even if the miller does. Others whisper that the grindstones will keep turning long after everyone's gone. You hear one old woman mutter that mills are like cats too proud to need anyone, but always watching. And then there's the mill cat. Sleek. Gray. Missing half an ear. It perches on a sack of barley and glares at you like you've insulted its lineage. It probably keeps the mice away, or maybe it's just the mill's second set of eyes. You're not entirely sure. Someone in line jokes about the miller's cut, and the others chuckle a little too hard. The phrase floats like a curse. It means to toll a portion of every sack of grain taken as payment. Typically, this was legal, even expected. 1/16, 1/12, sometimes more, depending on the region. But who's counting, really? Besides everyone. And here's where it gets spicy. Some millers, not content with their legal cut, would take a little extra. Not a lot. Just enough. A handful here, a scoop there. Some had a special scoop with a false bottom. Others dampened grain to make it weigh more, knowing it would dry lighter later. It was an art form flour fraud with flair. But, of course, the villagers knew, or thought they knew. And once trust was broken, it didn't matter if the miller played fair after that. You could be honest for a decade, but one suspiciously light loaf and people remembered your great-uncle's theft scandal like it happened yesterday. You step back inside and notice a heavy lock on the grain bin. Not to keep animals out, though that helps, but people? Because theft wasn't a one-way street. Sometimes the villagers stole back. Flour, grain, tools. There are stories of men sneaking into mills at night and taking back their fair share with a knife in hand and a sack over their shoulder. So the miller slept with one eye open, and when he slept, it was never deeply, always within reach of the ledger, the club, and sometimes even the grindstone, because while a sword might not belong to a miller, a well-placed pulley rope made a decent deterrent. He shows you his bed, a hard wooden bench in the loft above the main floor. It's dusty, narrow, and half blocked by old flour sacks. No pillow, no feather bed, just a cloak for warmth and a view of the front door. Romantic. If your idea of comfort includes moldy grain smells and waking up to rats scurrying past your nose, you wonder how often he actually sleeps. He shrugs when you ask. "Enough," he mutters. Then adds, "More than I did when the taxmen came every week. And that's another thing. Millers made money. Not king's ransom, but more than most. Enough to attract attention. Enough to make enemies. Especially when famine came and suddenly everyone was counting crumbs. So, when the rooster crows and villagers go home with flour in hand, the miller doesn't relax. He watches the road, sips from a cracked mug, and waits for the next sack to arrive, hoping it's grain and not trouble. You sit on the edge of the loft for a moment, feet dangling near the rafters, watching the dust swirl lazily in the sunbeam, slicing through the upper window. The scent of old wood, damp stone, and faintly sour grain clings to the air. Below, the miller finishes sweeping flour into a wide-mouthed bin with slow, practiced movements. You get the sense that everything here moves with deliberation, as though any misstep might cause a cascade of disaster, or at least someone banging on the door with a half-empty flour sack and an angry face. You tilt your head, curious now. Why did millers bother? Why do this job at all when it meant constant suspicion, endless labor, and sleeping with one eye open? He grunts when you ask, setting down his broom and leaning on the handle like it's holding him up more than the floor is. "Because someone has to," he says flatly. But then, softer. "And because the world runs on flour, whether it wants to admit it or not." You think about that. And he's right. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. Wheat and rye were the backbone of daily life. Baked into loaves, biscuits, porridges. If the harvest was good, people got bread. If it was bad, people starved. And no matter what, it all passed through the mill first, meaning the miller held power, even if he didn't wear it proudly. You peer again at the ledger. It's covered in names, tally marks, smudged weights, little scribbles that could be shorthand or just doodles from long nights. Some names are underlined, some have a question mark. You spot one that just says, "Owl Man, after rain." You don't ask. Millers didn't just grind flour, they kept a kind of order. A quiet balance between what went in and what came out. Between hunger and justice. Of course, balance is a tricky word in a time when literacy was rare. Bookkeeping was optional. And measuring tools were whatever you carved from a chunk of wood last winter. You help carry a sack to the hopper and watch the grain begin its journey. The sound of it cascading down the chute is strangely calming. A dry, whispering rush. You close your eyes and just listen. It could almost be rain. If rain smelled like toast and disappointment, the grain disappears into the grinding chamber, where the great circular stones spin against each other with deep, lazy groans. The top stone is called the runner, while the bottom stays still fittingly known as the bedstone. You imagine them like two giant teeth slowly chewing through a never-ending mouthful of grain. It's not an entirely comfortable image, especially when you remember that fingers have been lost in these machines before. And this, right here, is the miller's central duty, turning raw grain into edible powder, without losing a hand or his reputation in the process. And trust me, that second one's harder. The flour comes out pale and fine, soft like sifted silk, but clinging to everything it touches. You've already sneezed 6 times and your nose itches in ways you didn't know were possible. The miller doesn't even flinch anymore, and thus he probably hasn't smelled anything other than barley dust since childhood. While you sit, catching your breath and brushing flour from your sleeves for the 12th time, he begins explaining the real reason he watches everything so closely. It isn't just theft, it's survival. You see, a faulty mill doesn't just produce bad flour, it can ruin the entire community's food supply. If the stones are misaligned, they heat up. If they heat up, the flour scorches. Scorched flour is bitter, inedible. If you mess up a dozen sacks of grain during a bad harvest, people notice, loudly, with torches. So, yes, the miller is a bit twitchy. And no, he doesn't trust easily. But would you, when one loose screw or overly generous scoop could start rumors that end with your mill burning down? Historians still argue whether most medieval villages ran their own mills as part of a communal system, or if private mills like this were more common. The answer, inconveniently, is both. In some areas, local lords or monasteries controlled all milling rights. Peasants were required by law to grind their grain at a specific mill, often paying for the privilege. Other places had rogue mills like this one, operating quietly outside official oversight, trading in favors and hush money. The village near this mill seems small, maybe 30 or 40 households. And you can feel the tension in how they interact with the miller, not hatred, but a tightrope of tolerance. They need him. He needs their grain. But neither side forgets that relationships can sour faster than wet barley in a cellar. You ask about the church? The miller snorts. They love flour, he says, but they love taxing it more. It turns out even monks weren't above suspicion when it came to flour tolls. Monasteries often owned the land and the water rights, meaning the miller worked for them. Other times they competed. Either way, there was always someone in robes trying to peek at the ledger and mutter about honesty. You think monks were peaceful? Try telling that to Brother Alaric when his oat cakes come out gritty because you had a bad grind day. And that brings you to the ultimate irony: the miller is one of the few in the village who eats regularly. His work is constant and often thankless, but it pays. Not in gold necessarily, but in food, in barter, in favors. A wheel of cheese here, a cured ham there. Enough to keep his family fed and the roof from leaking mostly. Which means the resentment festers. Because when winter hits and food gets scarce, the man sitting on sacks of flour looks less like a hero and more like a hoarder. That's why the jokes about millers always carry a sharp edge. The tales about them stealing. The songs sung by children as they walk past the mill. They're part myth, part warning. And millers, in turn, keep their heads down and their clubs near. The afternoon sun glints through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting golden rays over flour-dusted beams. The miller checks his scoop, runs his finger through the new flour, and nods just slightly. Another batch done. No disasters, no fights, just the soft hum of the grindstone and the knowledge that today, at least, no one came demanding blood for bread. The grindstone rumbles low and steady beneath your feet, like a sleeping animal with a bad dream. You watch the grain flow down into the heart of the mill, and for a moment it's easy to forget that this soft, slow routine, this gentle avalanche of wheat is loaded with tension. It looks peaceful. It's not. The miller brushes flour from his sleeves with one broad sweep, then gestures for you to follow him to the measuring bench. It's a simple thing, rough-hewn wood, stained from decades of flour spills and thumb smudges, with a few odd scoops and bowls lined up along its edge. You notice that none of them match. One looks like it used to be a ladle. Another might have been carved from the end of a broken tankard. All of them serve one purpose, measuring just enough flour. Every customer pays with the toll, he explains, tapping a bowl with his knuckle. Not coin, not promises. Grain goes in, flour comes out, and I take my share. This toll is the heart of the miller's entire existence and reputation. You reach for a bowl and feel the fine dust cling to your fingertips. A toll wasn't standardized by law in most places. It was more traditional, negotiated, and ripe for abuse. A fair toll might be 1/16 of the flour produced. But what's fair when someone's watching and what's fair when no one's around are very different things. And here's where things get tricky. Because it's not just the toll bowl. You learn quickly that medieval measurements were more guidelines than science. Some millers dampened grain with water so it weighed more when it came in and dried lighter when it went out. Some accidentally used slightly larger scoops when taking their cut. Others rigged their scales with small weights hidden under the counter. You glance at the measuring bench again, suddenly suspicious of that oddly round pebble tucked into the corner. Historians still argue whether most of these tricks were common knowledge, folk wisdom passed between millers like secret handshakes or rare, scandalous exceptions. Were millers really that sly? Or did villages just like having someone to blame when harvest came up short? You watch the miller take a fresh scoop, level it off with a knife, and pour it slowly into a burlap sack marked with charcoal symbols. No customer name, just a slash, a dot, and a squiggle that looks suspiciously like a sleepy bird. You ask about it. Everyone's got their mark, he says. That's old Hannah's. You're halfway convinced he's making it up. But in a world where most people couldn't read or write, personal symbols were the next best thing, and heaven help the miller who mixed them up. Grain feuds were the kind of petty drama that could last generations. Families remembered which batch of rye made someone sick in 1342 like it happened last week. The miller points toward a small leather pouch on a hook. That's my keep, he says. It's not much, just a few ounces of flour from each batch. His official cut. But behind his voice is a weariness, because while it should be enough, it never really is. Not with tax collectors, clergy, and occasionally smugglers all sniffing around for their share. And not everyone pays the same toll. That's the dirty secret no one says out loud. Wealthier families might offer wine, candles, or favors to sweeten their deal. Widows and outcasts often paid more, not because the miller was cruel, but because he couldn't afford not to. Fairness, in this job, was often a luxury you couldn't risk. As you help load another finished sack onto the storage shelf, the miller grunts and squints toward the road. Someone's coming. A man with a limp, leading a donkey that looks like it's about to fall asleep mid-step. The man nods, unsmiling, and says nothing as he unloads grain from the donkey's panniers. The miller notes the amount in his ledger and takes it inside. The whole interaction lasts maybe a minute. Not a word of thanks. Not a single question. Once the man leaves, the miller exhales slowly. That's Elias. He mutters. Watches every scoop like it's gold dust. Claims I shorted him last winter. You raise an eyebrow. Did you? He shrugs. Maybe. Maybe not. Depends who you ask. That's how things work out here. No security cameras, no receipts. Just flour, memory, and grudges. Which is why, as you learn, most millers kept a running tally in their heads as well as on paper. You had to. Because the moment the wrong person thought you'd taken too much or not given enough, they'd start whispering. And once people start whispering, your days as a miller are numbered. That's also why the miller sleeps near the door. You look again at the sleeping corner, just a flattened mat near the fire pit, with a pile of old flour sacks as a makeshift pillow. Above it, a shelf of ledgers. Beside it, a rusted iron hook that might have once held a weapon, or maybe just a large spoon. Either way, it's within arm's reach, even in sleep. A miller must be ready. You ask if he's ever been robbed. He chuckles, the sound low and dry. Once, a boy from the next village thought he could carry off a full sack of flour in the dark. You wait. He didn't get far. Flour leaves a trail. That's the kind of poetic justice that only works in a world without asphalt. You imagine a pale breadcrumb path of dust leading back to a very guilty teenager with a sore back and a new fear of mill cats. The miller adjusts one of the toll scoops and offers it to you. Go on. Try it. You hesitate, but dip the scoop into a fresh pile. It's heavier than you expect. The flour warm and clinging. You try to level it off the way he did earlier. He shakes his head. Too full. That's a thumb's worth too much. Ah, yes, the infamous miller's thumb. An old joke, but not a kind one. People used to say millers developed wide, flat thumbs from pressing down on the scoop to steal more flour. Some even accused them of shaping their children's thumbs with boards to prepare them for the trade. Is it true? Probably not. But historians still debate whether the phrase came from real anatomical change or just a good story told too many times. You toss the scoop back on the table and wipe your hands. The miller starts bagging flour again, methodical and silent. You realize that everything here is a balance, the weight of the toll, the weight of the flour, the weight of trust. And the miller, perched between survival and suspicion, has to carry it all one scoop at a time. The next morning creeps in quietly, gray and damp. The mist clings low to the ground as if it's unsure about rising. You stretch the stiffness from your shoulders, feeling the flour grit in your sleeves and the ache of yesterday's lifting still hiding in your joints. Below, the mill is already awake. The water wheel groans its low, rhythmic sigh. The grindstone turns like it never stopped. And the miller, he's not just awake, he's watching. You catch him leaning in the doorway, eyes trained on the tree line, where something or someone rustles faintly. He's still, but his jaw works side to side, like he's chewing a thought. Then he mutters, "Too early for deer, too late for drunks." This is why millers sleep lightly. You imagine yourself in his place, sacks of grain lined up, flour stacked, tools neatly stored, each one worth more than most villagers see in a month. And all of it tempting. It's not that everyone in town's a thief, but hunger, jealousy, or even a bad rumor can nudge decent people into shadowy corners. So yes, millers guarded their stores like dragons hoarding treasure. No fire breathing, but plenty of snarling. You glance at the wooden club again, still near the door. Not that it would help much if someone came armed, but symbols matter. A club says, "I'm not defenseless." It says, "I don't trust you." And in a place like this, that message might just keep your skull intact. He tells you stories while checking the bin lids. One about a boy who tried to sneak a scoop of flour under his tunic and nearly drowned in the river trying to flee. Another about a neighbor's apprentice who left the mill door open and returned to find the flour scattered like snow across the field. The wind doesn't care about tolls. Neither do crows. Sometimes it wasn't even people. Rats gnawed their way through sacks. Foxes, emboldened by hunger, crept close to steal grain. And in one legendary case, a goat actually ate a full measure of ground barley before being tackled by a furious miller wielding a pitchfork and several very creative curses. But it wasn't all animal antics and clumsy theft. Sometimes trouble came with boots and entitlement. Local knights, small-time lords, or tax agents from the castle might arrive on horseback, demanding protection flour or enforcing tolls of their own. Some were official, others less so. The difference, whether they brought a scribe or a sword, you help tie off a fresh sack, pulling the twine tight with calloused fingers. The miller nods at your knot. "Not bad," he says. "You'd last a week here." You're not sure if it's a compliment or a death sentence. Later, a woman arrives with a cart full of rye, but also a wary glance at the door. She refuses to leave the cart unattended, hovering like a hawk as the miller unloads. You offer to help, but she eyes you like you're planning to pocket a handful of grain for breakfast. She's not wrong to be cautious. There were stories of rival millers or desperate townsfolk sneaking in with empty sacks and slipping away full. That's why many mills had a night shutter, a thick wooden barrier across the doors. Not just for weather, but for people. You notice the groove in the floor where the bar slides into place. Deep, worn, well used. Historians still argue whether millers' reputations for paranoia were earned or exaggerated. Some point to criminal records and local court rulings that often name millers as repeat offenders in theft or deception. Others say they were simply caught more often because they were visible, isolated, and essential. Like the village version of being famous for all the wrong reasons. You watch as the woman accepts her flour with a grunt and leaves without thanks. The miller doesn't mind. Or at least, doesn't show it. He turns back to his work. Movements precise. There's flour in the seams of his tunic, smudged along his jawline. You suspect he hasn't had a clean day in 30 years. And yet this isn't just about flour. It's about trust. Or the lack of it. You begin to understand why the miller can't sleep deeply. Why his ears perk at every noise. He's not guarding a fortune. He's guarding faith. The fragile illusion that this system works, even when no one's watching. You ask if he ever feared for his life. He pauses, then shrugs. Not often. Just during famine. Or after harvest failures. Or tax hikes. Or when I got someone's name wrong in the ledger. He chuckles softly, then adds, or when that widow thought I cursed her biscuits. Ah, yes, witchcraft. You haven't even gotten to that yet. There was always something just a little off about mills. The strange noises. The spinning wheels, the flour dust hanging thick in the air, catching the sunlight like ghostly mist. It gave the whole place an eerie vibe, perfect breeding ground for suspicion and superstition. Some believed millers used charms to keep their stones running smooth. Others accused them of enchanting the grain to stretch further for favored customers. And if someone got sick after eating a loaf, well, maybe it wasn't the rye. Maybe it was the miller. There's even a tale about a mill that refused to run after its owner died until his son sacrificed a chicken in the wheel pit. Was it true? Who knows? But enough people believed it to make you side-eye the next oddly quiet grindstone. You head upstairs to check the rafters for leaks, and find another strange little corner dried herbs hung from a nail, a scrap of parchment wedged behind a beam, a cracked clay idol of something. You don't ask. You already know the answer will be vague and unhelpful. Something like, for the flow or keeps the ghost out. And you wonder how much of this paranoia is earned, and how much inherited. Passed down like the toll scoop, like the ledger, like the habit of sleeping on your side facing the door. Being a miller wasn't just a job, it was a role, a performance, a mask of suspicion painted over with flour dust and gritted teeth. The day ends quietly, with the last grain ground, the wheel slowing to a gentle shudder. The miller sweeps the floor in silence, eyes scanning the door as always. And you, for the first time, feel the edge of what it must be like to live this life, to feed a village, and still feel like an outsider. You head to your corner, curl into your scratchy wool blanket, and just before your eyes close, you hear it, the rustle outside, a soft creak, then nothing. The miller doesn't get up. He just mutters. Third time this week, and tightens his grip on the club beside him. You wake to the familiar hum of the mill, the soft moan of the water wheel echoing beneath the floorboards. The morning light is hazy, filtering through dust-laced slats like it's not sure it wants to be here. And for a moment, you forget where you are until you shift and feel flour grit under your blanket and that unyielding wooden plank beneath your spine. Oh, right. The medieval Airbnb. No feather beds. No breakfast buffet. Just suspicion and a slightly stale heel of bread. The miller's already up. Of course he is. You hear him muttering as he checks the millstones. She's dragging again. He grumbles. You peer over and spot the slight hitch in the stone's rotation. Not much, just a faint stutter. He listens like it's speaking to him, frowning as though deciphering a particularly rude whisper. You shuffle over, still bleary, as he pries up one of the access panels and reaches inside with a long iron rod. Whatever's caught in there makes a thunk, followed by a puff of flour and what smells suspiciously like burnt oat. He sighs. Bird got in again. And that's the thing, these mills weren't clean. White-walled factories. They were alive in that uncomfortable way old houses are. Dusty. Groaning, full of surprises you didn't ask for. Birds, mice, bugs. Once, the miller swears, a snake coiled itself inside a grain sack and got ground halfway to flour before anyone noticed. It didn't improve the bread. You helped clean up the mess, though help might be generous. Mostly, you stay out of the way while the miller works with a kind of grim ballet tugging ropes, adjusting weights, tapping stones like a doctor checking reflexes. It's fascinating in a terrifying sort of way, because this isn't just mechanical knowledge, it's instinct. And here's something else: you start to realize the machinery might be old, but it's complex. The water wheel outside pulls its energy from the current, which turns a shaft that moves gears, which spin the runner stone above the bedstone. It's a medieval transmission system made of wood, leather, iron, and willpower. One loose cog, and everything stops. Or worse, it grinds too fast. Too hot. A misaligned stone could start a fire in the flour chamber. Yes, a fire. You didn't think flour could burn. Oh, my sweet summer child. Flour dust, in the right conditions, is basically medieval TNT. All it takes is a spark, a bit of friction. Maybe lightning striking too close, and boom, the bread factory becomes a brief, angry sun. There are stories. One village mill went up in smoke after someone tried to light a lantern near an open hopper. Another collapsed when the water wheel seized and cracked the main shaft. And every time something like that happened, people blamed guess who? Not the wind, not the wheel. The miller. Historians still argue whether medieval mill accidents were as common as the records suggest, or simply the most remembered events because, well, exploding flour leaves an impression. Either way, it meant millers walked a tightrope. If they did their job right, no one noticed. If they slipped once, everyone noticed sometimes from across the valley. So yes, the miller's a little obsessive. He sharpens blades that don't need sharpening yet. He oils joints twice a day. He tests the flour texture between his fingers like a chef with a vendetta. You watch as he adjusts the chute flow again, squinting like it just insulted his mother. And you get it now. This job wasn't boring, it was exhausting. Mentally, physically, socially. The only thing more dangerous than running a mill badly was running it well, because that drew attention. And attention, in the Middle Ages, usually arrived with a tax form or a torch. By midday, a few villagers have wandered in. One brings a complaint his flour is too coarse. Another thinks her grain came back lighter than it went in. The miller handles both with a patient glare and a finger to the ledger. "You brought in 7 stone," he says, pointing. What came out was 6 3/4. Damp grain loses weight. That's just math. She doesn't look convinced. But she leaves. This is your favorite part of the day, watching the miller deflect accusations with the weary confidence of someone who's been accused of every possible thing short of arson. Though you're not entirely sure that's not on the list too. He catches you smirking and snorts. "They think I eat it all," he says, "like I'm sitting on a throne of biscuits back here." You picture it. A crumbling flour kingdom, breadstick scepter, crown made of moldy rolls. Glorious? He goes on, "But you know what really keeps me up, Rivals?" You blink. Rivals, turns out, not all millers were content with their own corner of the stream. Some tried to poach customers. Others dammed the river upstream, slowing water flow to your wheel just enough to cause problems. A few ambitious ones even bribed lords to move toll rights. Milling wasn't just a trade, it was a turf war. There are tales of nighttime sabotage wheels cut loose, sluice gates jammed with branches, even mills mysteriously collapsing after a thunderstorm no one remembers hearing. One rival, the miller claims, used to walk past his door whistling just to check if the wheel was still turning. That's medieval, for I'm watching you. You follow him to the edge of the water where the mill race curves. The wheel turns slowly, soaking wet, creaking rhythmically. He kneels, checks the gate, runs a hand along the mossy boards. Too much silt lately. He mutters, Could be upstream. Could be sabotage. Could be both. You ask if he'd ever sabotage someone else's mill? He pauses. I wouldn't, he says. Then adds, but my uncle might have once. Maybe twice. You don't press. As the light fades and the grindstone slows, the miller starts locking up. He checks each door, each latch, pulls the night shutter into place with a heavy thunk. The mill groans, tired and sealed. The day's work is done. Almost. Because later, after the moon rises and the fire burns low, someone knocks. Once, then twice. The miller doesn't answer. He doesn't move. He just listens. After a long pause, the footsteps fade. You look at him. He says nothing. Just adjusts his club by the bed and closes his eyes, just one. Of course, you lie awake longer than you meant to. The knock still echoes faintly in your head, though it's long gone now, swallowed up by night and damp timber walls. The mill is quiet, but not silent. You can hear it breathe, the creak of beams settling, the occasional plink of water dripping from the wheel, and somewhere beneath it all, the slow, heavy sigh of the grindstone winding down, like an old man finally giving in to sleep. Except the miller isn't asleep. You glance down from your cot and see him lying on his back, one hand on his chest, the other still resting on that club. His eyes are closed, but you'd wager good flour he's not dreaming. Just listening. Waiting. And you get it now. Because a medieval mill was a strange space. Not quite public. Not quite private. It belonged to the village, but not really. Everyone came here, but no one stayed. It sat at the edge of life, connected by flour but removed by suspicion. This edge of society status was old, even by medieval standards. Some early legal texts lump millers in with butchers, executioners, and other necessary undesirables. Tradespeople needed, but didn't exactly invite to the festival. And that tension between need and mistrust gave birth to a lot of weird social rules. You remember what the miller told you earlier about his family? How his father was a miller? And his grandfather. It runs in the hands, he said, holding up a palm stained white. But it also ran in the reputation. If your great-grandfather was accused of shorting the village during a famine, people still side-eye your flour, which meant millers learned to keep their heads down, to watch what they said, and perhaps most importantly, to raise their children quietly. You ask him about that in the morning, as you help scoop flour into fresh sacks. Did your father teach you everything you say? The miller nods. Mostly. The rest you learn when someone tries to burn your mill down. You're not sure if he's joking. You laugh anyway. He talks more freely now, between work. Maybe he's warming to you. Maybe he's just tired. Either way, he starts describing what it was like learning the trade. Not with books, not with school, but by shadowing his father. Day after day, season after season, learning the rhythm of the stone, the sound of proper grind, the way to smell scorched flour before it ruined a batch. There's a hum, he says, a perfect hum. When the stone sings true and the grain's dry and the wheel's happy, you feel it in your bones. He closes his eyes, but when it goes wrong, you feel that too. He says the first time he ran the mill alone, he cried. Not from fear, but from the weight of it. Every mistake cost someone bread. Every misstep could ruin a week's work. And the worst part, No one thanked you when you got it right. They just assumed it should have been. You sit with that for a bit. He shows you the old runner stone, cracked and leaning against the back wall. Split during a storm. Lightning hit the wheel. She jumped like a scared horse. You run your hand along its surface, smooth in some places, jagged in others. You imagine it spinning fast. Hot. Dangerous? The miller tells you about the time he had to rebuild half the gearing with just one helper and a borrowed cart. Took 2 weeks. Everyone came complaining. He chuckles. None of them offered to help. Just brought their grain and asked when I'd be done. You ask if he ever considered doing something else. Anything else. He shrugs. This is what I know. What else would I do? Be a baker. He snorts. I like flour. I don't like people. He shows you the sharpening tools next. A set of chisels wrapped in oiled cloth, worn from years of use. Millstones don't just spin forever. They wear down, flatten out, lose their bite. And a dull stone makes poor flour or worse. Dangerous flour. Too fine. And it clogs. Too coarse. And it ruins the bake. So every few weeks he halts the mill, lifts the heavy runner stone, and re-chisels the grooves by hand. It's called dressing the stone, he says, tapping one with pride. A good dress lasts a season. A bad one ruins your name. Historians still argue whether millers were truly masters of this maintenance or whether they relied on wandering specialists. Some regions had entire families devoted to stone dressing, traveling from mill to mill with their tools and stories. Others claim that every good miller was also a part-time mason. You wonder how one learns to chisel stone grooves by firelight, hands numb with cold, knees stiff from crouching. You just do, the miller says, as if that explains everything. He lets you try, hands you a small chisel and points to a worn patch on a practice stone. You tap once, it skitters. Tap again. Better. By the third strike, your wrist already aches. He grins. You wouldn't last 2 days. You believe him. Later, while tending the flour bins, you notice something odd, a set of faded etchings near the beam where he keeps his ledgers. Not names, not weights, symbols. A star, a wave, a circle with a dot. You ask. He hesitates. Marks, he says, old habit. From when I was a boy, my father said it kept the stone true. He doesn't elaborate. You press, it's just for luck. You get the feeling that in a world of sabotage, theft, fire, taxes, wild goats, and moldy grain, luck might be the most sacred force of all. As the sun begins to set, the mill slows again. Another day of flour done, another handful of tolls tucked away. The miller doesn't smile. Exactly. But his shoulders drop a little. Relief. Maybe. Or just exhaustion. He tells you a story as he lights the evening lamp. About a boy years ago who wanted to be a miller. Who thought it would be peaceful. Quiet. Simple. And how, after one winter, he realized it was none of those things. But by then, he says, looking at the flame, it was too late. I already knew the sound of the stone. He settles into his cot again, this time with a heavy sigh, and you realize maybe he doesn't sleep with one eye open because he's scared. Maybe it's because he doesn't know how to close both. You wake to a sound you haven't heard before. Not the wheel, not the grain chute, not even the soft flutter of pigeons loitering in the rafters like shady traders. This is laughter. Real, actual laughter, sharp and short, like someone accidentally let it out before realizing where they were. You rub your eyes and peer over the loft's edge. There's someone new in the mill. A younger man, maybe late teens, with a mop of dark hair and a crooked smile. He's hoisting a sack onto his shoulder like it weighs nothing, and talking quickly as the miller listens with the distinct expression of someone trying not to look amused. "That's my nephew," the miller mutters to you, before the boy even opens his mouth again. "Here to learn the trade, or ruin it. We'll see." You climb down just as the boy, whose name is apparently Toma, nearly drops the sack on his own foot. The miller winces, but says nothing. You both know better than to speak when someone's dignity is on the line. Turns out, Toma is here for the week. Just long enough to think it's fun. The miller mutters. You quickly learn that training in the mill is code for carry heavy things and try not to break anything. Toma's enthusiasm is equal parts charming and exhausting. He asks 1,000 questions. What's that noise? How heavy is a millstone? Why don't they use horses? Could you grind coffee in here? The answer to that last one is a blank stare and a dry, "If you want to start a fire in your kitchen." But amid the chaos, you see something else. Pride. The miller doesn't say it. Of course, that would be far too obvious. But the way he watches Toma handle the grain, the way he grunts approval instead of barking corrections, it's there. Subtle, but real. You help them both load grain into the hopper. Toma insists on doing the scoop. "I've got the thumb for it," he jokes, holding his hand flat like a butcher showing off a prime cut. You laugh. The miller doesn't, but there's a twitch at the corner of his mouth. As the grindstone picks up speed, the three of you fall into a rhythm. One feeds the hopper, one bags the flour, one ties off and stacks. It's not elegant, but it works. Toma hums as he works something tuneless but cheerful. The miller rolls his eyes but doesn't stop him. That's when he tells the story. Long time ago, he begins. Between tying sacks, a miller had 3 sons. He didn't know who to leave the mill to, so he gave each of them a test. First, he gave them all the same bag of grain and told them to make the best flour. One son added chalk to make it whiter. One sifted it until it was silk. The third didn't touch it, just ground it as it was, saying, "It's honest flour, let it be." He gave the mill to the third one. Not because the flour was the best, but because he'd still be there the next morning. You don't know whether it's true, but Toma nods solemnly like he's just heard a prophecy. You smile. Another story added to the mill's walls. And there are so many. Little moments etched into the beams, scrawled in the ledger margins, whispered in the evening glow. Like the time the river froze solid and the entire village had to haul water from buckets just to turn the wheel manually. Or the year a bear wandered in looking for grain. We gave him the old oats, the miller deadpans. He didn't tip well, but not every story is warm. There was a fire once not here, but at a neighboring mill. Someone blamed bad flour. Someone else blamed the miller's daughter for witchy habits. What caused it? No one knows. But the result was clear, scorched beams, lost lives, and a mill that never turned again. Historians still argue whether medieval mill fires were usually accidents or convenient cover-ups. and whether certain superstitions like sprinkling salt at the doorway or hanging bones over the grain chute were safety measures or spiritual insurance. You spot some of those charms around this mill now that you're looking. A worn strip of cloth tied above the door, a dried clove tucked into a beam. Nothing flashy, nothing obvious. Just little whispers against bad luck. By afternoon, Toma has blisters, a limp, and a flower beard that refuses to brush off. He flops onto a sack with a groan. People actually choose this job. The miller, without missing a beat, says, "No one chooses. The job chooses you. You don't know if it's true, but it sounds good." And Toma seems too tired to argue. As the grindstone slows and the last sack is tied, you find yourself lingering near the wall of tools, among the hammers, scoops, and chisels. You spot something strange, a bundle of feathers bound in twine, hanging beside a wooden gear. You raise an eyebrow. The miller shrugs. Keeps the stone light? Really, no. But it makes people ask fewer questions. You laugh. The miller finally cracks a real smile. Just for a second. Then it's gone again, replaced by that ever-watchful expression as he checks the door latch and taps the grain chute one last time. As the evening settles in, Toma collapses on a pile of sacks and is asleep within minutes, snoring like someone who's never known real mill work until today. The miller watches him quietly for a moment, then tucks a folded cloth under the boy's head. You climb to the loft, stretch out, and exhale. And just before you drift off, you think maybe this life wasn't chosen. Maybe it is passed down like a family curse in a burlap bag. But for all its creaks and dust and paranoia, there's something strangely comforting about the sound of a wheel turning steady into the night. Even if you have to keep one eye open while it does, you awaken to a commotion not loud, exactly, but urgent. The miller's voice, low and firm, Toma's feet scrambling across floorboards, and that ominous creaking sound of something heavy being dragged across stone. You rub your eyes and peer down. The door is open. A sack lies torn, its contents spilling like a ghostly puddle across the floor. A trail of flour leads to the doorway, out toward the still dark yard. The miller is already outside, club in hand. Toma lingers behind, shifting awkwardly, half awake and covered in sleep wrinkles and guilt. "I didn't hear anything," he mutters, voice tiny. "Course you didn't," the miller replies, not unkindly. "You were asleep. I was listening." You pull on your boots and follow them outside, where the trail becomes clearer in the damp dirt, a fine dusting of flour leading toward the trees. Like someone dropped breadcrumbs for a very nervous pigeon. The tracks are light, small, someone barefoot, maybe a child, or someone desperate enough to risk an entire morning's meal for a half sack of flour. No animal did this. The miller says flatly, "They'd eat it here." You stand in silence, the chill wrapping around your arms like old smoke. There's no chase, no angry shouting, just the realization that even in a sleepy corner of the world, theft never really sleeps. It crouches in the dark, listening for the hum of the wheel and waiting for the moment someone snores too loud. Back inside, the miller sets to work as if nothing happened. The door gets bolted, the chute gets checked, the grind resumes. But you notice his movements are tighter today. Sharper. Less patient. He doesn't speak for a long while. Eventually, he breaks the silence. That's the third time this season. He says could be the same one. Might not be. You ask what he'll do. Nothing. He replies, if they needed it that bad, they'll be back. And if they're foolish enough to keep coming back, he taps the side of his ledger. They'll leave tracks. You look over his shoulder and see new notations in the margins. Not names, not weights. Just a symbol. A line, then a cross through it. A warning. A memory. A breadcrumb trail of his own. This wasn't uncommon. In fact, some millers developed their own secret code, a way to record irregularities, suspicions, patterns. Not all thefts were reported. Some were quietly avenged. A faulty grind? A short measure? A note sent to the local reeve that maybe the woodcutter's son has too much bread for a bad harvest. Historians still argue whether millers were fair in their quiet retaliations, or if they used these moments as opportunities to settle personal scores. In truth, it was probably both. You didn't survive as a miller by being entirely honest. You survived by being selectively honest. You think about this as you help Toma repair the broken sack. It's salvaged with rough stitching, but you know it's marked now reused grain bags always are. Their scars tell stories. A patch here means mice. A burn mark there. Likely a candle dropped in a moment of distraction. Or sabotage. That's the thing about flour it remembers. It clings to everything: hands, breath, tools, time. You begin to understand why so many superstitions orbit the trade. The belief that flour absorbs energy, that bad thoughts can ruin a batch, that a cursed grain will never bake right, no matter how hot the oven. And, oh, the stories you hear today. As the grind continues, the miller opens up, maybe because the theft reminded him that silence doesn't keep you safe. Or maybe he just needs someone to listen who isn't Toma, asking if you can mill tree bark. He tells you about a neighbor, years back, who lost everything in a fire. The villagers blame the weather, but the miller, he says it was because the man lied about his flour tolls, took more than he was owed, swore it wasn't him. Then his roof caught fire in a clear sky. You ask if he believes it. I believe the village believed it, he says. That's enough. Really. Because belief in a place like this is more powerful than truth. Belief will make you build charms from string and bone. Belief will have you whispering to your grindstone before bed. Belief will lead a mob to your door if someone sees a shadow move too close to your flour sacks. Toma listens with wide eyes. So, are we cursed? The miller looks at him. Deadpan. You, maybe? Me, I'm insured. He pats a small carved amulet hanging above the ledger. You want to laugh, but also, you're not entirely sure he doesn't believe it. Later in the day, a woman arrives carrying an unusually large bundle wrapped in cloth. You help her unload it. It's grain, of course, but mixed. A blend of barley and rye. Cheap grain, often reserved for poor families or livestock. She's quiet, eyes darting toward the shadows near the door. The miller treats her like any other customer measures it, logs it, starts the grind. But you notice the way he leans closer to the bin, the way he tests the flour texture more than usual. Finally, he pauses. This grain's been stored wet. He mutters to you. Sprouted in the sack. You wrinkle your nose. Still edible for pigs, he says. Then louder, he calls out, might not bake right. You sure you want it ground?" She nods once and says nothing more. As she leaves, the miller lowers his voice again. "She's not feeding pigs." You glance after her. You think it was her last sack. He doesn't answer. Just adds a note in the margin again. A tiny grain stalk with a single dot beside it. You wonder if he'll leave some flour behind next time. Or maybe just a little extra in the toll scoop. Not enough for anyone to notice, but enough to feed a child. Maybe. You won't ask. This is how the mill works. Not just with stone and wheel, but with memory, suspicion, small kindnesses, and smaller secrets. Every sack tells the story. Every scoop is a gamble. And as night falls once more, the door is bolted tighter than usual. The miller says nothing, but you catch him adding something new above the entrance, a sprig of dried rosemary tied with red thread. You don't ask, because even if it doesn't keep thieves out, it might help the miller sleep. At least with one eye. The next morning arrives damp and hesitant. The kind of gray dawn that clings to your skin before you even step outside. Inside the mill, the air is thick with flour and tension. The wheel groans to life more slowly than usual, as though even it isn't quite ready to face another day. You yawn, stretch, and glance over to find Toma still curled up on a flour sack, snoring softly with his hand wrapped around a scoop like it's a stuffed animal. The miller is already moving, of course. He's been up for a while. The mill doesn't stop, not really. Not even for sleep. You join him by the drying racks, where something new catches your eye. Parchment. Real parchment stretched and pinned to wooden frames. Slowly drying. The skins are pale, almost translucent, and they ripple slightly in the faint breeze like ghosts trying to slip free. Parchment, you ask? The miller grunts. Not for books, for records. Turns out, when the flour sacks start piling too high and the weather turns, written ledgers aren't enough. You need long-term storage, something more durable than paper. So the miller's been making his own parchment from leftover goat hide. Not common, not easy, and not exactly fragrant. You lean closer. The smell is unforgettable. Like wet leather soaked in vinegar and left out during an argument. Toma stirs awake, groaning theatrically. Is it always this smelly? Yes, the miller says. Welcome to documentation. You hadn't thought about the paperwork or goat work of medieval milling, but records mattered. Toll logs, customer tallies, harvest weights. If the taxman came knocking, you'd better have something more than a shrug and a chalk mark on the floor. Especially since mills were heavily taxed. In some regions, they weren't just taxed, they were licensed, monitored, sometimes even claimed by the church or the local lord. The very act of building a mill could be political. Historians still argue whether most medieval mills were privately owned, feudal monopolies, or operated communally. The truth, as always, is that it varied. But one thing's clear wherever there was a mill. There was someone trying to control it, which is why the parchment matters. It's protection. It's history. It's proof. If someone accuses you of undermeasuring grain last autumn, you point to the goat skin and hope it hasn't warped too badly. Can't trust memory alone, the miller mutters, especially when people's memories change to suit their needs. You can't help but notice the irony. This whole trade is built on memory of sounds, of grain textures, of who paid what and when. And yet, even the miller doesn't fully trust it. Hence the parchment. Hence the dried rosemary at the door. Hence the club. After breakfast, hard bread and water with the touch of last night's flour still floating in it, you help load more grain into the hopper. The process has become routine, almost meditative. Scoop, pour, grind. Scoop, pour, grind. Until the rhythms of the wheel seem to match your breath. But today, there's a visitor. He doesn't knock. Just walks in like he owns the place, which, given his shiny boots and fur-lined cloak, he very well might. A tax official. You can tell by the parchment roll tucked into his belt and the faintly disappointed expression on his face, like everything he sees is slightly beneath him. The miller stiffens instantly, not out of fear, more like muscle memory. Master Gerwin, the visitor says, voice smooth and lazy. Still turning, still grinding, the miller replies. They don't shake hands. They don't even nod. Just stand there for a moment. The wheel creaking quietly behind them. Two men engaged in a centuries-old contest of who can blink last. You learn quickly that the tax collector isn't here for flour. He's here for numbers. How much grain came in last month? How many tolls collected? Any irregularities in weight? Any rumors of unlicensed toll increases? The miller answers each question with a word. Sometimes two. He doesn't flinch. He doesn't explain. He simply gestures to the ledger, then to the parchment. The taxman unfurls one, squints, frowns, makes a note. Toma? Watching from the sidelines? Whispers. Why is he writing so much? You whisper back, because he doesn't like being proven wrong. It's a tense, silent performance. You don't know who's winning. But eventually, the taxman nods once, rolls up his notes, and departs without another word. No goodbye. Just the sound of expensive boots fading down the path. The miller exhales, not relief, just release. Leeches with scrolls, he mutters. At least a thief takes something useful. You resume work, the tension still lingering like smoke after a candle snuffs out. Toma tries to joke something about throwing flour at the next visitor, but the miller just hands him another scoop and keeps grinding. Later, he tells you a story about a neighbor's mill that was seized by the local bishop because the owner couldn't pay the tax. The family tried to resist. The wheel was burned. The owner fined. The villagers left to grind by hand for months. You ask how often that happens. Not often, he says, but often enough. You help with the parchment next. It's dry now, but stiff. The miller begins copying records with a small, stubby quill. His handwriting is surprisingly neat-rounded, deliberate, with occasional flour smudges where his fingers slipped. He doesn't write everything, just enough. The rest stays in his head, passed down with nods and gestures and side glances. Because here's the truth, the mill isn't just machinery. It's memory. It's reputation. It's a living record of everything the village wants to forget but can't afford to. And as you watch him tuck the finished parchment into a clay jar and seal it with wax, you realize something else. The miller might not sleep much. He might not smile often. But he remembers everything. And that's how he survives. You wake to the smell of wet hay and damp stone, and the slow realization that the grindstone isn't moving. The silence is almost louder than the usual groaning wheel. You sit up in the loft, blink toward the half-light of morning, and notice the miller standing still in the center of the floor, not working, not scowling, just staring at the stopped gears. Toma stands beside him, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line of confusion. Then you hear it just beneath the silence, the soft but unmistakable squelch of mud, the kind of sound that says the river is high and the wheel is stuck. Down at the sluice gate, it's clear what's happened. A sudden overnight rainstorm, probably upstream, has brought down branches, leaves, and what might actually be part of a sheep. The mill race is clogged. The water is sludging against the debris like a drunk trying to open a tavern door. Well, the miller says, she's jammed. You think he might be talking about the wheel, the sheep, or the day ahead. Possibly all three. You wade into the mess with him and Toma, boots sinking ankle deep in mud. The water is cold, fast, and smells faintly of rot and mildew and some ancient secret you're better off not knowing. You try to lift a branch, slip, and nearly lose a boot to the current. Toma laughs. The miller doesn't. Clearing the mill race becomes your morning task. And it's not glamorous. You use poles, shovels, and at one point, a pitchfork that may or may not have been cursed during a particularly bad harvest in 1382. The sheep, miraculously, is not dead, just annoyed. By midday, the wheel begins to turn again slowly, creakily, like a grumpy elder being woken up from a nap. You sit on a rock and catch your breath, covered in river slime and more twigs than seem statistically reasonable. Toma flops down beside you and declares, "This is definitely not in the job description." The miller shrugs. If the wheel doesn't turn, no one eats. And he's right. You hadn't really felt it until now, the total dependence. The way everything in this world comes down to that spinning wheel. It's not just a job. It's the stomach of the village. Without it, people go hungry. They grind grain by hand until their arms give out. They trade food for favors. They steal or starve. The miller says, most people don't think about the wheel until it stops. That hits harder than it should. As you walk back up to the mill, soaking wet and shivering, he tells you a story. Years ago, a neighboring village had 2 mills, 1 water, 1 wind. A storm hit. The water wheel jammed. Just like today, but the windmill blown clean off its foundation. Roof landed in the bakery. 3 days of grinding by hand, he says. People swore they'd never complain about the toll again. They did, of course. Historians still argue which was more reliable in medieval Europe, wind or water. Windmills needed space, height, and favorable breezes. Watermills needed a steady flow, cold-resistant parts, and ideally, no wandering livestock. Water won in most regions, especially mountainous ones like this, but neither was foolproof. You return to the grindstone with fresh respect. It's turning now, slow but steady, and the sound is practically soothing. The hum is back, the one the miller described before. You feel it in your chest, a vibration more than a sound, the rhythm of sustenance. Then you notice something odd, a faint crackle underfoot. Flour dust. So much of it has settled into the floorboards over the years that it puffs up like powder under each step. It's kind of beautiful. Also, vaguely explosive. You ask the miller if he's ever worried about that. Dust fire, he says. Only every day. He tells you about another mill long since gone where someone lit a lantern too close to the chute. The dust caught, the flame leapt, and the whole thing went up like dry parchment. The only thing left intact was the iron crankshaft. Still warm a day later. After that, he says, I started using rushlights. You glance at the dull, waxy stub burning in the corner. It gives off more smoke than light. But you understand now. Safety, in a medieval mill, wasn't about fire codes. It was about habits. He even shows you a trick. Before lighting anything, he sprinkles water along the floor and into the air. It doesn't douse the dust entirely, but it settles it. Just enough. You think about how the entire building is a tinderbox. Wooden beams, dried grain, dust, cloth, tools made from iron that could spark if struck wrong. The fact that this place has lasted decades, maybe longer, isn't luck. It's obsession. Later, as you sweep, you catch sight of something behind a barrel, an old fire hook. Rusty, curved like a shepherd's crook. You pull it out. For pulling down beams, the miller says. You blink. To save the mill. No, he replies. To bring it down faster. If the fire spreads too far, you hold it a little more gently after that. These aren't just tools. They're choices. Plans. The miller has prepared for things you didn't know were possible. Fire. Flood. Theft. Cursed sheep. You wonder if he's ever had to use the hook? He doesn't say. That night, the wheel turns quietly. The sacks are stacked. The ledger's updated. Toma collapses into sleep before the fire even burns low. You sit with the miller, both of you staring at the glow. He says people think this job is about flour. You wait, it's about being ready. For when the wheel doesn't turn, you nod. Then ask the question you've been holding in your chest all day. And what happens when you're gone? The miller doesn't answer right away. Finally, he says, then I hope someone's listening to the stone. He leans back, closes one eye. The other stays open just barely. The fire pops. The wheel hums. And somewhere, in the quiet between turns, you hear the whisper of a world that still runs on patience. Paranoia. And the eternal sound of grinding grain. By now, the mill feels like its own small world, a dusty, rhythmic pocket of creaks, scoops, and unspoken understandings. You wake not to a sound, but to a lack of one. No clatter, no humming wheel, no muttering miller cursing the crooked scoop. Just stillness. You sit up, peer over the loft rail. There's movement, but not from the usual suspects. A man stands in the middle of the mill floor, hands clasped behind his back, eyeing the grindstone with the kind of detached interest reserved for tacksmen, landlords, and people who think they know better. He's dressed simply but neatly, too neatly for anyone who actually works with flour. His boots are clean, his hands soft. Not a speck of dust on him. Even his belt pouch sits too high and too shiny, like it's never once brushed a workbench. The miller stands to the side, arms folded, gaze sharp. You climb down quietly. Toma is already pretending to be busy in the corner, stacking sacks that don't need stacking. You do the same. This, the visitor says, gesturing to the stone, is very nearly illegal. That gets your attention. Turns out the man is an auditor sent by the local lord to inspect toll practices. Apparently, There have been whispers, vague complaints about shorting, about toll scoops growing mysteriously wider, about flour coming back a shade too coarse. Nothing official, just smoke. And in the miller's world, smoke always means someone's looking for a fire. You watch the miller say nothing, not a twitch of guilt, not even a raised brow, just stillness, like a coiled spring waiting to see if the tension will snap or release. The auditor continues. He wants to see the toll measures, the ledgers, the parchment records. He demands them with the bored confidence of someone used to compliance. The miller nods once, fetches the scoop, his scoop, the one you've seen him use every day, and sets it on the bench. The man picks it up like it might bite him, weighs it, sniffs it, bizarrely, then sets it down and asks, "Do you have the original toll measure this was based on?" The miller doesn't answer, because of course he doesn't. That scoop was carved by his father, probably shaped from a broken ladle and smoothed over decades of use. There is no official prototype. It's a tool and a tradition all in one. It's just always been that scoop. Historians still argue whether toll scoops were standardized in medieval villages or if they varied wildly. Spoiler, they varied wildly. Lords tried to enforce uniform sizes, but with little success. Most millers either made their own or inherited one. Some even used different scoops depending on the customer. You begin to understand why. The auditor sniffs again and starts to measure flour. He asks to see the tally for the last week's grind. The miller produces a goat hide parchment, unfolds it, and waits. No explanations. Just math. The auditor scans it, frowns, and notes something. 2 pounds less from the blacksmith's grain than the expected yield. The miller shrugs. His rye was wet, and the widow's stored in burlap. Moldy. The auditor narrows his eyes. So we're to take your word for it. You came all this way, the miller says calmly. Might as well. You can't help but smile. The auditor doesn't. He asks to inspect the grindstone. The miller lifts the runner and lets him knock on it with a spoon like he's testing a melon. You all watch in silence as he nods sagely, then tries to write something without smudging his pristine cuffs. Eventually he straightens, pockets his notes, and says, "You'll hear if there are further inquiries." He leaves without another word. The door closes. The silence hangs. Then the miller exhales. A long, slow breath that could have carried a windmill. Toma says, "You think he'll be back?" The miller doesn't answer, just picks up the scoop, turns it in his hand like an old friend, and slides it back onto its nail above the workbench. That afternoon, work resumes, but differently. The pace is slower, quieter, like the air itself is waiting for a verdict. You help shift flour, and for the first time, notice how often the miller glances toward the road. Not obviously, just flickers of the eye, like he's measuring shadows. Later, you ask him if that kind of inspection happens often. Often enough, he says. When there's talk, who talks? He shrugs. Anyone. Everyone. Someone wants their toll cut. Someone wants the mill. Someone's jealous. Someone's hungry. That's the thing about milling. There's no such thing as perfect neutrality. Every measurement favors someone. Every decision creates resentment. And every sack that leaves the mill carries a little bit of that weight. There's a phrase you overhear that evening. spoken quietly between the miller and Toma as they patch a torn sack. Taking the thumb, you ask what it means. The miller hesitates, then shows you grabbing a scoop, pressing his thumb hard into the top so it packs just a little tighter. That extra bit. That's the thumb. And back in the day, he says, it could get you flogged. In some regions, taking the thumb was a punishable offense. Officially, millers were forbidden to press down on toll scoops or to manipulate weight in their favor. Some places even kept official toll stones engraved benchmarks to weigh against. But in reality, most villages just relied on trust. Or suspicion, Toma asks. So why do it? The miller looks at him. Because 2 handfuls of flour might mean someone eats tomorrow. Might mean I keep the door shut through winter. He tosses the scoop back on the table. It's not about being fair. It's about being careful. And that really is the soul of the mill. It's not run on gears and grain alone. It runs on caution, on calculation, on the careful art of just enough not too much to get caught, not too little to make enemies. You lie awake that night, listening to the quiet churn of the millstone, and think about that scoop. The way it weighs not just flour, but trust, and how sometimes survival means knowing exactly when to take the thumb. The next day begins with something odd singing. Not loud or joyful, not the kind you belt at a festival or hear in a tavern. This is quiet, low, almost whispered. The miller, of all people, is humming under his breath as he sharpens one of the chisels used to dress the grindstone. You don't interrupt, partly out of respect, partly out of fear that he'll stop if he knows you're listening. Toma catches it too, nudges you with a smirk, and mouths. He sings, you shrug. Stranger things have happened. Outside, the morning sun catches on dew-stained grass, and the mill seems lighter somehow, despite the weight of the last few days. The auditor hasn't returned. The river is flowing steady, and for the first time in a while, there's no one waiting at the door with a sack of half-wet barley and a complaint. The grindstone, though, isn't turning. Today is maintenance day. You help tilt the runner stone. Now familiar with the steps brace lever, ease it down slow. The bottom stone is revealed grooved, worn, streaked with the stubborn residue of 100 meals. The miller lays out his tools like a ritual. Chisel, mallet, wire brush, tallow for grip, and a pouch of powder that smells faintly metallic. This, he says, is the dangerous part. You blink. More dangerous than dealing with angry customers or suspicious inspectors or potential mill fires. Yes, he says, because it's quiet. You forget to be careful. You watch as he begins to redress the stone, carefully carving new grooves furrows. He calls them into the surface. They spiral out from the center like a nautilus shell, designed to draw the grain inward as it grinds. Too shallow, and the flour will be coarse. Too deep, and the grindstone will overheat, even crack. It's precision work, and you quickly understand why he doesn't let Toma do it yet. Used to take me days, he says, tapping a fresh groove. Now I can do it in one. Doesn't mean I rush. You sit beside him, the steady chip, chip, chip of the mallet oddly soothing. The stone dust floats into the air like mist. You resist the urge to sneeze. As he works, the miller tells you about the accident. It happened to a miller in a neighboring village. A good one, by all accounts. careful, consistent. But one day, his stone split mid-turn. The runner fractured down the center, flinging shards of granite across the room like angry birds, killed a dog, took off part of a man's foot, and just like that, the miller says, he was done. Mill never reopened. You ask why the stone broke. Dressed it too deep. He replies, tried to get more flour faster. Maybe the Lord was pressuring him. Maybe he was behind on toll. Doesn't matter. The stone doesn't care about reasons. Only weight. Historians still argue whether grindstone accidents were truly common or simply feared with mythical reverence. But one thing's certain when a grindstone failed. It wasn't subtle. It was loud, violent, and usually final. You look at the massive disk of rock before you with new respect. It turns so slowly, so steadily. It hums like a lullaby, but it has teeth. And if you treat it wrong, it bites. The miller finishes the dressing by late afternoon. He wipes the stone with a cloth soaked in vinegar and oil, muttering something under his breath, maybe a blessing, maybe just a habit. Toma leans in, trying to listen, but the miller shoos him away. You'll learn it when it's your turn. The runner stone is lowered back into place with care. Every movement deliberate. The wheel is tested. The chute is cleared. By sunset, the grind resumes. But it's not just the stone that's dangerous. It's the room. You've noticed something lately. How often tools disappear. Not mysteriously, just misplaced. How many sharp things live in this building? Hooks, knives, chisels, chains. Heavy sacks balanced on high beams. And you remember the whispered story from days ago about a miller who fell into his own machinery. That phrase again. Fell. Toma asks about it. Casually, like someone testing the waters of a pond that might be deeper than it looks. Do millers ever get pushed? The miller pauses. They fall. He says, sometimes. You wait. Sometimes they fall because they're drunk. Sometimes because they're tired. Sometimes, he shrugs, because they didn't see it coming. You think of the clubs, the knives, the locked doors, the way everyone keeps track of who's in the mill and who isn't. It doesn't take much. A slippery floor, a misplaced sack, a push. Historians still argue whether mill-related deaths were truly accidents or quiet acts of vengeance. But even today, in hushed corners of rural towns, old folks will whisper about that. One time the miller went quiet. And if the death came during a hard season, if the toll had been high and the bread loaves small, no one looked too closely. Mills burn easily, and fire erases a lot of evidence. You shiver. Later, after supper, Toma asks another question. What happens if I mess up the dressing? The miller doesn't miss a beat. Then we start over. Toma nods. What happens if I break the stone? The miller finally looks at him. Long, flat, measured. Then you're not a miller. And that, you realize, is the real toll of the trade. Not just the flour, not just the physical weight, but the responsibility, the legacy, the knowledge that one mistake, one rushed cut, one careless grind can end more than just a day's work. You head to bed that night with the sound of newly dressed stone in your ears. It's louder now, crisper, like it's been reborn. The wheel turns smoother, the grind more even, the whole mill feels fresher. But as you close your eyes, you can't stop thinking about that other mill. The one that cracked, the dog, the foot, the silence that followed, and how easy it would be for someone to fall or be pushed, and how the stone would never tell. By the time the rooster crows the next morning, the mill is already alive with soundstone on stone, water against wheel, and Toma grumbling about sore arms and flour in places no one should ever have flour. You step into the main room and catch a faint scent of pine resin and old wax. The fire's already burning. The wheel groans in rhythm. And on the workbench, a jar filled with something thick, black, and faintly shimmering in the low light. You ask about it. The miller doesn't even look up. Ink. Toma, always ready to overshare, leans in. He makes it himself. Pine soot and vinegar. Sometimes goat bile. You immediately regret asking. Turns out, on top of running a mill, keeping ledgers, dodging taxes, surviving floods, and not being murdered by torch-wielding villagers. Some millers also made their own ink, especially those far from towns where paper and quills were hard to come by. You don't ask about the bile again. You just accept it. He uses the ink to mark today's parchment a fresh tally of the grain processed this week. Each sack noted with initials, weight, and one of those strange symbols you've come to associate with old grudges. You're starting to recognize them now. A crescent means recurring customer. A slash through it. Probably someone with an unpaid toll. A spiral. Toma thinks it's the local brewer who keeps trying to pay in weak ale. As the day moves on, you sense something else hanging in the air. Not tension exactly, just expectation. Everyone's working with more focus. Fewer jokes, fewer breaks. Even Toma's gotten quieter. That's when you learn today is inspection day. Not a tax inspection. Not a toll dispute. No one from the village. This is something older. Stranger. Maybe even a little holy. Because today, the monks are coming. You glance at the miller. Monks. He nods once. They test the flour. Every season. Always have. You wait for more explanation. You get none. Around midday, they arrive two men in threadbare robes, sandals dusted from travel, their hair tonsured in the shape of quiet authority. One carries a walking staff. The other carries nothing. But both carry the kind of silence that makes you sit up straighter without realizing it. They say little. No introductions. Just a shared nod with the miller, who gestures to the sacks. The first monk crouches beside one and unties the string with practiced fingers. He dips a wooden spoon inside, lifts a scoop of flour, and lets it fall back into the sack in a soft woof. Then he tastes it. Yes, tastes it. You watch as his face tightens slightly. Not displeased. Just calculating. The second monk reaches for a smaller scoop, pinches a bit of flour between his fingers, and rubs it slowly. Then he nods once. No words. No good job. No excellent grind. Just a nod. Then they test another sack. Then another. You ask the miller, what happens if they don't like it? He shrugs. Depends. Might say a prayer. Might raise prices. Might call it cursed. You blink. Cursed, he doesn't elaborate. Because here's the strange thing about medieval mills: they lived at the crossroads of labor, economy, and mysticism. For all their practical uses, they were also places of power. The wheel turns. The grain transforms. Something physical becomes something spiritual, flour into bread. Bread into communion. It's no wonder people saw mills as holy or haunted. Historians still argue whether these seasonal monk inspections were formal church policy or just local traditions. Either way, they happened, and their verdicts carried weight. A condemned batch could ruin a miller's standing, a blessed one that was worth more than gold. The monks finish their review in under an hour. They exchange a few words with the miller too quietly for you to hear. Then they leave. No coin. No scroll. Just a sprig of rosemary left in the threshold. Toma asks, "Is that good?" The miller doesn't answer, but he hangs the sprig on a nail beside the door, next to an older, dried one already yellowing with age. The rest of the day feels like exhale. The grind resumes. The bags are stacked. The fire crackles again. No one mentions the monks. You try. Once. So, what did they really do with the flour? The miller gives you a look. You ever had monastery bread, you nod? Then you've had ours. That night, as the fire burns low, Toma practices scooping flour with the smaller toll measure. His thumb keeps slipping. The miller watches silently, then eventually walks over and adjusts his grip. Not like that. You're pressing. Toma groans. But I'm barely touching it. Exactly, that's the point. You hear it again, that lesson. That weight. It's not about stealing. It's about surviving. About taking just enough to avoid notice. About knowing when the monks are due, and what the baker prefers, and whether the Reeves' wife is watching from the window. There's a knock at the door, not hard. Just a soft tap. The miller tenses, then opens it. It's a boy, thin, nervous, holding a small cloth bag of grain. His voice barely rises above the wind. My mother sent this. The miller takes the bag, nods, then closes the door without a word. You watch him pour the grain into a bowl, test it between his fingers, then glance at the scoop on the wall. He chooses a smaller one, says nothing, just grinds, because even on holy days, the toll is due, and even honest millers measure carefully. By the next morning, you've learned to recognize flour in all its moods. There's the light, airy puff of dry wheat flour, the kind that floats in the air like it's trying to escape. Then there's the damp, heavier slump of rye after rain. And then there's today's flour. Heavy, gritty, uncooperative. You don't even need to ask. One glance at the miller's furrowed brow and the way he mutters under his breath while adjusting the chute tells you someone's grain isn't grinding right. It's the blacksmith's. Again. Stone was too coarse, the miller says. He stores it in his forge loft. Picks up soot. Oil. Might as well be grinding gravel. You help scrape the clogged chute while Toma tries to stir the grain into something workable. It clumps. It sticks. It resists. Like the grain itself knows it's not wanted. It'll gum up the mill if we're not careful. The miller adds, so now you're on cleaning duty. And that means brushing, wiping, and occasionally chipping grain residue from between the grooves of the newly dressed grindstone? The irony is not lost on you. Days ago you were admiring the precision of this machine. Today, You're elbow deep in a pile of what might technically qualify as pancake glue. This isn't just a bad batch, it's a political batch. You learn the blacksmith is influential in the village. Not quite noble, but close. His tools matter. His horseshoes matter. His vote at the next village council definitely matters. And so, even though his grain is awful and his tolls are late, the miller grinds it anyway. That's just the way it is, he says flatly. Toma looks confused. Shouldn't we tell him to clean his grain first? The miller snorts. You want to tell the man who sharpens every axe in town that his flour's full of ash? Fair enough. Historians still debate how much influence tradesmen had in medieval villages. Lords and clergy held the official power. But blacksmiths, brewers, and yes, millers wielded their own social currency. Sometimes cooperation was survival. Sometimes silence was... You wonder aloud how the miller decides when to speak and when to stay quiet. He replies, You speak when there's no one left who'll speak for you. Not before. That sticks with you all morning. And it comes back around midday when a new visitor arrives a reeve. The village official, tall, lanky, and wearing an expression that suggests he suspects everyone of everything at all times. He brings a clipboard. Well, not a clipboard, but a wooden plank with notches and a strip of twine wrapped around it, medieval shorthand for I'm keeping tabs. The reeve's tone is polite. Too polite. Just doing the rounds, he says, making sure no one's taking liberties. The miller doesn't even glance up. You want to check the toll? The reeve shrugs. Just a peek. For the record. He watches the next scoop carefully. Watches how it's leveled, how it's bagged, how it's marked. Then he watches the next. Then the next. Then he asks a question that changes the room's temperature. Do you remember Brother Teshin's batch last spring? The miller stops. A long silence. You don't know who Brother Teshin is, but you know the name matters. And you know that silence is where the real stories live. The reeve continues. He said his barley came back short. Thought maybe your scale was off. Another pause. I remember, the miller says. His barley had worms. Toma makes a face. The reeve says nothing else. Just notches something on his board. Thanks the miller. And leaves with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who knows exactly how unnerving he is. When the door closes, Toma breaks the silence. What was that about the miller shakes his head? Brother Teshin lies, but he prays loudly, so people believe him. That's the thing you keep learning. Truth doesn't matter as much as perception. In a world without cameras, audits, or anything resembling an appeal process, rumors are as sharp as blades, which is why that afternoon, the miller does something that surprises you. He opens the oldest ledger. Dust blooms from its pages. The cover is cracked leather. The ink faded. Inside, years of tallies. Names you've never heard. Dates scratched in the margins. Toll rates, crop failures. Scribbles that might be curses, or maybe just very tired math. He points to a page marked with a small, 6-pointed star. That was Teshin's first grind. 5 years ago. Shorted him once, by mistake. He's never forgotten. You look at the numbers, it's barely a difference. Maybe a scoop. Maybe not even. But in this world, maybe is enough. Toma frowns. So why not just give him a little extra next time, the miller replies. Because then I'm admitting I stole. And if I admit it once, he doesn't finish. He doesn't have to. You begin to understand how millers get reputations. Not just from what they do, but what they don't do. What they refuse to say. What they don't apologize for. Silence isn't passive here. It's armor. You ask him later if anyone's ever tried to ruin him with rumors. Oh, sure, he says. A few. Mostly men who owed toll and didn't want to pay. Or ones who wanted their sons to inherit this place instead of mine. You glance around. This place, he gestures at the whole mill. It's not much, but it's power. People want it, or want to destroy it. And in that moment, it hits you. This is why the miller sleeps with one eye open. Not just because of thieves or rats or wild goats, but because of stories. A whisper can bring more destruction than a storm. Before bed, you help Toma sweep the floor. You find a handful of grain stuck behind the chute. Moldy. Useless. He lifts it toward the bin. The miller stops him. Throw it out. Toma hesitates. It's just a little. It only takes a little. The miller says. To spoil the whole sack. He's talking about grain. But you know he's talking about more than that. The morning begins with something you've come to expect by now, a new complaint. A wiry old man with a crooked cane stands in the doorway. A sack of grain slung over one shoulder, and a scowl etched deep into his face. He doesn't say hello, he doesn't say please. He says last time. Your flour turned my bread to stone. The miller doesn't flinch. He just replies, without looking up. Maybe your oven's jealous. Toma snorts. You cough to hide your laugh. The old man doesn't find it funny. You've noticed this ritual. Villagers arrive not just to have their grain milled, but to air grievances. About the toll. About the weight. About how their mother's bread never turned out like this when she was baking. You could fill a book with these complaints. The flour is too wet and other tales of mild inconvenience. But here's what's different today. After the man leaves still grumbling, the miller doesn't return to the grind. He pauses, then says something you weren't expecting. We'll test the batch. You blink. Test it. He nods. Every few weeks we do a trial bake. Just a crust. Just to see. Toma perks up. You mean bread? The miller ignores the enthusiasm but begins gathering supplies. A handful of flour, a pinch of salt, water from the barrel near the door. He mixes everything in a chipped clay bowl. His movements more precise than you expected. You watch as he forms a rough dough, kneads it once or twice, then rolls it into a flat circle and lays it on a slab of hot stone pulled from the edge of the hearth. No fancy tools, no oven, just stone and fire and instinct. The smell is immediate, earthy, warm, comforting in the way only bread can be, especially when it's scarce. The crust crisps. He flips it. You all lean in. And then he breaks it. He tears the loaf in half and examines the crumb. Dense but not damp. Golden but not burnt. He tastes it. Chews. Chews again. Then nods. Nothing wrong with the flour. Toma tastes next. Bit plain. The miller shrugs. It's supposed to be. You taste it. Too. And for a moment, everything feels oddly peaceful. The world shrinks to this small circle of heat and flour and steam. No tolls, no taxes, no rumors. Just bread. But, of course, it doesn't last. Because outside, someone else is arriving. This time, it's not a customer. It's a messenger. Young, wide-eyed, dusty cloak, and nervous. He hands the miller a folded slip of parchment, sealed in wax, bearing the insignia of the local lordship, a name you've heard muttered before, usually with equal parts respect and resentment. The miller opens it without ceremony, reads, and sighs. You lean in. Bad. He hands it to you. The note is brief, formal, and ominous. Your toll records for the current season have been called into question. An official review will occur within the fortnight. Prepare accordingly. Toma goes pale. Again, you look to the miller, expecting anger or panic, or at least mild sarcasm. But instead, he just says, "We knew it was coming." And that's when the real work begins. The next 2 hours are a flurry of motion-pulling ledgers, drying parchment, sharpening quills. Toma's sent to fetch more goat hide from a neighbor. You help the miller gather sacks to verify weights and remeasure the toll bins. Everything gets checked. Everything gets triple-checked. It's not about truth anymore. It's about defense. Because if there's one thing you've learned, it's that flour can lie, or at least look like it lies. And if someone powerful wants to find fault, they will. Why now, you ask? The miller grimaces. It's the season. They always come near winter, when toll disputes are loudest. You remember what he said a few days ago, people notice what they don't get. Never what they do. This isn't a surprise, it's a cycle. He tells you about past inspections, some that ended quietly, others with fines. One, years ago, where a miller was dragged before a magistrate for misrepresentation of grain weight. His punishment: 2 days in the village stocks, and a fine he never paid. Why stocks? Toma asks, so the village could laugh. The miller replies, bread tastes better after justice. Historians still debate whether public punishments for toll fraud were common or rare. But in small communities, shame traveled faster than grain. And mills, being public-facing and vital, were especially vulnerable to accusations, true or not. That evening, the miller begins preparing a special ledger. Not the one used every day. Not the real one. This one's curated. You keep two, you ask, trying not to sound judgmental. Sometimes, he replies, one for truth, one for survival. Toma whistles. Isn't that lying? The miller stares at him. Do you trust the people checking the truth? And suddenly the whole world tilts. This isn't dishonesty for gain. It's dishonesty for protection, for keeping the mill open, for keeping bread on tables, for making sure one family's complaint doesn't result in a ruined business. Still, you feel uneasy watching it. That night, as the fire flickers low, the miller sits quietly at the workbench, quill in hand, writing carefully. His face is unreadable. His eyes are tired. You lie in your corner, unable to sleep. The bread crust from earlier still lingers on your tongue, simple, plain, honest. And now you wonder how many loaves are made from flour measured not in weight, but in fear. It rains the next morning steady, soaking, unapologetic rain, the kind that makes roof beams groan and hearth smoke and gives every bag of grain a faint whiff of wet dog. You pull your cloak tighter and peer outside. The miller's already awake, of course, sitting on the threshold like a gargoyle, watching the water trickle down the mill race and muttering about the sluice gate. Toma, looking half asleep and fully soaked, drags in a bundle of wood. The fire's useless, he grumbles. The smoke's just sitting in the rafters like a ghost with nowhere to go. The miller doesn't answer. He's focused on the rain, on the way it's falling. You've come to recognize this look. It means something's not quite right. The river's too high, he says finally, and too fast. You step closer. Sure enough, the normally steady watercourse has become a frothing, angry snake. The wheel is still turning, but too fast. The grindstone inside, you can hear it whining, not humming. Whining? We stop, he says simply. Standing. Toma stares. But we just started. If we don't stop now, the wheel takes the shaft takes the stone takes the floor takes us. You help throw the lever to disengage the mill gears. It's a clunky mechanism, primitive but clever wooden teeth that can be lifted out of place to let the wheel spin freely without turning the stone. Once it's done, the silence feels wrong, not peaceful, tense. No grindstone means no flour. No flour means no bread. And today of all days, just before the inspector is expected to arrive, feels like the worst possible time for everything to grind to a literal halt. But there's no choice. Even millers can't fight water. Instead, the morning becomes a flurry of indoor activity. The miller checks parchments, tests weight scales, tightens sacks. You help retally ledgers, transcribe notes, and in one memorable moment, rescue a mouse from drowning in the flour bin. You name him Crumb. Toma insists on giving him a farewell crumb. The miller is quieter than usual, focused, calculating. You ask if he's nervous about the inspection. No, he says. You wait, I'm angry, and that's somehow worse. He explains in theory. Inspections are about fairness, accuracy, but in practice, they're about leverage, about who owes who, about favors traded and favors called in. And this time, the inspector coming is not just from the Lord's office. He's church. You raise your eyebrows. Toma stops chewing his bread crust. A monk, Toma asks. The miller shakes his head. An enforcer? A scribe? The kind who pretends not to judge, then writes your name beside a sin anyway. Turns out, church-appointed inspectors were a very real thing in medieval communities, especially when mills were tied to tithes or when monasteries had a stake in the toll system. A few off-tally scoops and suddenly your soul, not just your scale, was in question. Historians still debate whether this was about genuine morality or just another form of control. Probably both. But for millers, the result was the same. More eyes, more rules, more chances to fall. The miller doesn't panic, but he does something you've never seen before. He opens a drawer beneath the ledger bench and removes a small bundle wrapped in wool. Inside a second scoop. Smaller, older, worn so smooth it shines. This, he says, was my grandfather's. You pick it up. It's light, slightly warped, a little uneven. Why use this one, you ask? He shrugs. Because they'll measure this one against the toll stone at the priory. You blink. They have a toll stone? He nods. Marble. Carved. Blessed, supposedly. The miller holds both scoops in his hands, now his usual one, and this older relic. One built for balance, one built for optics. Toma leans closer. So you're switching. The miller doesn't answer directly. He just sets the old scoop on the bench and begins reheating the ink pot. Because this inspection, it won't be about flour. It'll be about appearances, about penance, about whether your scribbles align with the church's scrolls, whether your scoop fits the blessed stone. You ask if they've ever shut a mill down before. The miller's answer is immediate. Yes. And in his silence, you imagine it. A wheel halted, a grindstone stilled, a ledger burned, a family out of work, a village without bread, all over a few grains too many. The rain slows, the light changes, and suddenly there's a knock at the door. Not hurried, not shy, just 3 steady taps. The miller answers it. Standing in the rain is a thin man in clerical robes, parchment in one hand, metal rod in the other. His boots are spotless, his expression unreadable. You don't need an introduction. You already know this is the inspector. He steps inside, glances around, and nods once. No grinding today, Rivers High, the miller replies. Convenient. Not a question. Not even an accusation. Just a comment hung in the air like a cobweb. The miller gestures to the bench, the ledgers, the toll bins. The inspector begins. He checks the parchments, the measurements. He weighs a bag twice. He studies the scoop. The grandfather's yes. Good choice. Then, unexpectedly, the inspector steps to the hearth, pulls a folded scrap of cloth from his sleeve, opens it. Inside is a stone, round, smooth, marked with etchings. You realize this is the toll stone. He sets it on the bench, holds the scoop over it, and waits. You can almost hear the heartbeat in your ears. The scoop fits. Not perfectly, but well enough. He nods again. That's all. And just like that, he's gone. You sit in stunned silence. Toma lets out a breath loud enough to wake the dead. The miller doesn't move, doesn't speak, just watches the door for a long moment. Then, finally, he says, he'll be back in spring. And just like that, the toll returns, the rain slows, the wheel creaks, the grind resumes, the flour falls, and the old scoop goes back in the drawer, where it will wait, just in case. You would think that after the inspection, things might quiet down, that maybe the miller would ease up. Toma would go back to humming tunelessly, and you could spend a morning just enjoying the steady rhythm of the grindstone without wondering who might barge in next. But you've clearly forgotten where you are, because just after breakfast, a few slices of last night's crust and some very stubborn cheese, someone knocks again. This time it's not a monk, not a tacksman, not even the reeve. It's a boy. Thin, dirt-streaked. Maybe 10 or 11. His clothes are patched in places, and he's breathing hard, like he's been running. Someone's working a mill in the woods. He says. The miller doesn't react. Toma, of course, blurts out, "Wait another mill." The boy nods. Near the stream by the hollow, behind old Gert's field. They're grinding at night. Quiet. But I saw flour sacks. The miller still says nothing. He walks to the corner of the room and picks up an old cloak. One you haven't seen him wear before, dark. Heavy. Lined with fur. Then he grabs a lantern. Not the usual smoky rushlight, but a proper oil lamp. Toma looks at you. Eyes wide. We're going. Right you are. The 3 of you plus the boy, who insists on tagging along make your way through the trees, past wet underbrush and a handful of half-collapsed stone fences. The path grows narrow, winding. The sound of water returns, a familiar trickle, not the main river, but a stream. And then you hear it grinding. Faint, rhythmic, wrong. You crouch behind a bramble and peek through. There it is, a hidden mill, smaller than yours. Cruder, but the wheel turns, the stones grind, and a man in a red cap works the chute. Humming as he goes. The boy whispers. I told you, you whisper back. How long's it been here? He shrugs. A month, that's when the miller finally speaks. Rogue mill. 2 words. Heavy with meaning. In medieval times, rogue mills were illegal operations. Mills built without permission from the Lord, the church, or whoever claimed milling rights in a region. They siphoned grain, dodged taxes, operated in the dark, literally. And they were dangerous. Not because they were poorly built, though they often were, but because they undermined everything. You ask the miller, should we tell someone he looks at you like you've just asked if fire's hot? Of course not. You blink. If we tell the reeve? He explains. They'll think it's my doing, that I'm trying to eliminate competition. Toma frowns. But you didn't even know it existed. Doesn't matter, it's my word against theirs. And I'm already the miller. You realize something chilling in that moment being a miller means not just watching your own back, but watching the shadows around you. 2. Because someone's always trying to take what you've built, or make it look like you're taking too much. You suggest confronting the rogue miller. The miller shakes his head. That's not how this works. You return to your mill in silence. That night, the miller does something new. He teaches you how to listen. Not to people. To the mill. He shows you how the stones sound when they're misaligned. How the whump-whump of a grain jam differs from the dry scrape of a poorly dressed furrow. He taps the wheel, listens to the echo, feels the vibration through the beam. Ears first, then eyes. He says. Toma mutters. What about noses? The miller snorts. If you can smell it, it's already too late. He sets you both a test, blindfolds you, starts the wheel, and asks you to identify what's wrong just by sound. It's absurd. You guess wildly. Toma insists the mill is haunted, but after 3 tries might you start to hear it. The difference between a proper hum and a forced one. Between a stone that glides and a stone that bites. It's strangely beautiful. Like tuning an instrument you didn't know you could play. And then he tells you the real reason for the lesson. If that rogue mill fails, he says, and people eat bad flour, I get blamed, you frown. But it's not your fault. Exactly, he says. That's the game. That's always been the game. If someone eats tainted bread from a hidden mill, they don't blame the one in the woods. They blame the miller, because there's only ever supposed to be one. Historians still debate whether rogue mills were truly rampant or just local legends. Boogeymen invented by millers to scare off competition. But records do show fines big ones for unauthorized grinding. Sometimes entire villages were punished. And when a mill was found out, it was destroyed. The wheels smashed, the stones broken, the site cursed, sometimes by order, sometimes by fire. The miller leaves you with one last warning that night if anyone asks. You didn't see anything. And just like that, You understand the burden of the trade. It's not just keeping flour from burning, it's keeping secrets from spreading. The rogue mill is never mentioned again. Not by the miller, not by Toma, not by the boy who led you there and has now mysteriously stopped showing up at the door with news. It becomes a kind of unspoken ghost, just one more creak in the bones of a place already full of them. But you can feel its presence. Every sack weighed a little more carefully, every ledger entry written a little neater, every toll scoop double-checked, then checked again. You find yourself listening harder. To the rhythm of the wheel, the scrape of the chute, the thud of boots outside that might belong to a reeve. Or worse. It's during this heightened tension that something unexpected arrives as song. Not sung, not performed, but scribbled on a scrap of parchment, jammed into a crack in the outer wall. You find it while sweeping. At first, you think it's just a prayer or some strange ledger note, but it rhymes. Badly. The miller weighs but does not tell. His thumb is heavy. Tolls not well. If flour's short or bread turns thin, perhaps he'll meet the wheel again. You bring it to the miller. He barely glances at it. Old song. They sing it at festivals. Toma, wide-eyed, asks, "Is it about you?" The miller sighs. "It's about all of us." Because yes, millers had folk songs. Not the flattering kind. More like long, passive-aggressive Yelp reviews set to lute music. Songs that warned against cheating. Songs that hinted at curses. Songs that occasionally included names, and occasionally those names weren't changed. One ballad, still sung in parts of the countryside, tells the tale of a miller who salted his flour to make it weigh more and was chased into the river by an angry bride on her wedding day. You ask if it's true. The miller smirks. Only the part about the bride. Historians still argue whether these songs were warnings, satire, or simply tools of community memory. But they mattered. And when a song about you started spreading, your reputation could turn to ash overnight. So the message in the wallet's not innocent. It's a warning. Toma thinks it's from the rogue miller. You think it might be worse someone local? Someone who wants the wheel to stop? Maybe a customer? Maybe a rival? Maybe just a bored man with too much time and too little bread. That night, the miller doesn't bolt the door like usual. He nails it. You lie awake and listen to every sound, the shuffle of wind under the eaves, the soft splash of water against the wheel, the occasional scrape that could be a rat or could be something else entirely. At some point, you hear him walking the perimeter of the mill, just once, just checking. By morning, he's back at the grind, as if nothing happened. But then Toma finds something else. In the ledger, right beside yesterday's entry, a new line, "Watch your toll, lest songs return." Not in the miller's handwriting. You all stand around it in silence. The air in the room goes very still. You expect the miller to get angry, to tear the page out, burn it, curse. He does none of that. He pulls a knife from under the bench, gently slices the offending line from the page, and tucks the strip into the fire. Then, calmly, he writes the day's actual toll below it. "This isn't new," he mutters. "They've always sung about us. They always will." You glance at the fire. What do you do when they won't stop? He stares at the flame. You outlive them. You don't ask if he means the singers or the songs. Toma, sensing the mood, finally speaks. So what now? The miller replies, now we keep grinding, because what else is there? You return to work, measure the grain, listen for clogs, stack the flour, and for a while it feels normal again, until nightfall. That's when you hear the second verse. From outside, not loud, not shouted, just sung low, in a voice that doesn't care if you hear or maybe wants you to hear. The stone may turn, the wheel may groan, but truth will grind the miller's bone. If thumb is pressed or flour's gone, the toll shall weigh the soul at dawn. Toma looks like he's seen a ghost. You step toward the door. The miller grabs your sleeve. Don't. You wait. The voice fades. The silence returns. You sleep with one eye open that night, not because the miller told you to, but because you finally understand why he always has. The next morning, no one talks about the song. Not over the morning bread, which is tougher than usual. Not during the inspection of the sacks. Not when the wheel starts turning again. Just as it always does, creaking like old bones. Humming with the weight of duty. The strip of parchment is gone. The verse sung in the dark has vanished with the fog, but the feeling remains, like a splinter under the skin. The miller doesn't flinch. He doesn't speak of revenge or plans or justice. He simply works. And in that silence, you realize something important. His answer to every threat is survival. Toma, of course, has questions. Should we tell someone? The reeve. The monks the miller answers without looking up. Tell them what? That someone doesn't like their flour. You understand now. There's no protection to be found in pointing fingers. In a world where bread keeps people alive, suspicion follows the baker, the seller, and especially the miller. When something goes wrong, it's always the wheel turner's fault whether or not his hands ever touch the loaf. And yet, he keeps turning that wheel. You spend the day helping as usual. The work is heavier today. Not because of weight, but because of watchfulness. Every scoop is deliberate. Every ledger entry second-guessed. The miller listens harder. You catch him tasting the flour with more care. Once he even rejects an entire sack, not because it's spoiled, but because something about it feels wrong. You think it's poisoned. Toma asks. The miller doesn't answer. Just pours it out into the compost pit behind the mill. No drama. No declarations. Just quiet refusal. It's around midday when a familiar face returns the old man with the crooked cane. The one who claimed his bread had turned to stone. He carries a new sack of grain. He says nothing. The miller doesn't greet him. Doesn't ask about the last loaf. He just weighs the sack, takes the toll, and logs the entry. The old man watches. Then, after a long pause, says, "It baked fine the second time?" The miller nods. Dry grain works better. They don't smile. They don't shake hands. But something in the air shifts. Just slightly. And that's the rhythm of this place. Not forgiveness, exactly, but function. The grind must go on. Even if the trust doesn't. Later, as Toma and you stack the last flour sacks of the day, he mutters, "I don't think I could do this forever." The miller hears him. "You don't have to." Toma blinks. "I thought I was learning to take over." "You are," the miller says. But it's not a sentence. You ask, "Did you ever want to stop?" He doesn't hesitate. Yes, then. But then who would I trust to count the toll you imagine that a village with no miller, no ledger, just confusion and accusations and bread that doesn't quite rise? You realize this isn't just about flour, it's about balance, precision, order, even if no one thanks you for it, even if they sing songs about your thumb. That evening, the fire is warm. The ledger is closed, the door is locked but not nailed. You sit quietly, listening to the last drips from the wheel outside. Rain's on the way again. The miller leans back in his chair, eyes half closed, and says, "They think we're all thieves." You wait. Maybe we are, but we're also the ones who feed them. And he's right. For all the suspicion, the songs, the warnings and inspections and angry knocks at the door, they keep coming back because someone has to grind the grain. Someone has to measure. Someone has to know when the flour is too coarse or too fine, or just right. You don't speak as you climb to your cot. The grindstone has stopped for the night, but you swear you still feel its pulse beneath the floor. A heartbeat of flour and stone and centuries of whispered trust. Toma's already asleep. The miller rests with one eye closed, the other still watching, always watching. The wheel turns slowly now. The night wraps itself around the old beams of the mill, seeping through the cracks like a warm fog. The grindstone rests. The sacks are stacked. The ledgers are silent, and even the fire flickers with a gentler rhythm. Outside, the rain begins. Not fierce, just soft. Gentle. A steady drum on the roof that soothes more than startles. You lie in your cot, listening to the hush. The smell of flour still clings to the air, earthy and warm, like the promise of bread. The stones are still. The gears no longer creak. The only sound is the faint sigh of water beneath the wheel, lapping like a lullaby. And for once, the miller isn't moving. He sleeps now, arms folded across his chest, mouth closed, no club in hand. Just peace. Toma, curled beside a flour sack, mumbles something in his sleep, probably about goats. Or bread. Or both. And you feel it too. The strange calm that settles in after the last sack is filled, when the stones have said all they needed to say. The wheel will turn again tomorrow, but for now, everything is still. Let the rain fall. Let the world go quiet. Let the flour settle in the bins and the dust drift in the moonlight. You are safe. The toll is counted. The stone is dressed, the night is long but kind. So close your eyes, the mill will wait, and the wheel always turns.